Can you hear me now? My apologies. So take a moment to talk about NSF. There's several major interagency international initiatives that are underway. I'd like to talk about those. And then I switch gears a little bit. So why are those initiatives underway? There's some underlying things that are happening in the cyber infrastructure community. There's a lot of changes that are happening. There's a lot of things that are emerging. This is actually one of the hotbeds of research, so I'm really delighted to be here today. Thank you so much. And just briefly, a little bit on cyber infrastructure that's going on, because I come from the advanced cyber infrastructure portion of the foundation, that there's some news that's going on in computing and in data, so just a couple of things there. And then I think the big thing is that there's some challenges, and that's why there's initiatives. There's some problems that are going on that we just are having difficulty addressing. And so it's nice because a lot of those challenges are being talked about in the sessions today and tomorrow. So I'll look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Okay, here's the one chart on the foundation. Basically, there's about $7 billion that come into and out of the foundation every year. All but 6% goes right back out into the community to basically research, instrumentation, capabilities. We get about 50,000 proposals a year, and the success rate is about 1 in 4. The foundation, basically, its underlying community has traditionally been those 4,200 colleges and universities throughout the country, the 4 years and 2 years, although only about 2,000 of those are currently funded. That's an interesting area of change because it has traditionally been the universities. One of the things we're finding is, as you heard a moment ago, there's a lot of consortia forming. There's a lot of very rugged and valuable industry capabilities that are developing. So if you're trying to get research done, how do you do it effectively and efficiently? That's, I think, one of the things all of us are wrestling with. Basically, there's hundreds of thousands of researchers that are out there and that are being supported now. What we're finding is the capabilities that are being developed in this community, actually, the sustainable, underlying, powerful capabilities are what are helping a lot of those researchers to win major awards in their communities. Nobel Prizes, just being a valuable. One of the things also that's important is most of the people that are trained by universities do not go on to be professors. Most of them go out into industry. They go out and they become teachers in the community. They go out and do very different things. So what does the community continue to do? So again, some of the topics that are our issues. So, okay, that's NSF. What I'm going to do now is for the next half a dozen slides or so, every year there's a budget. There are things that they list in there as their high priority items. The things down the side in the bullets are some of the things that there's a slide on each of those that is coming up. Some of those have been around for a couple of years. All of them are multi-million-dollar activities. All of them across different directorates within the organization. You'll see, and I apologize, there's a lot of 3 and letter acronyms. It's the pieces of the foundation that look totally like universities, whether it's engineering and things like that. Having come from NASA, the National Acronym Slingers Association, we have a tendency not to tell you what our acronyms stand for. My apologies. But basically a chart on each one of those. Here we go. One of the biggest things that's been around for several years now is cyber infrastructure in the 21st century. Is that one of the things that's been out there is this big data initiative that the president announced a couple of years ago. A number of research activities have been developed and funded under that rubric. Another thing, and it's the thing that I have been heading, is the data infrastructure building blocks. So a couple of the things that has funded, for example, you'll hear the very next talk by Carol Song was one of the awards that came through that program. But in any case, there's also funding for major software activities, computational and data-enabled science activities, and these are partnerships among organizations. For example, in the data infrastructure call, that when we were looking for things that address key needs in the community, basically every one of those initiatives is funded across multiple organizations in the foundation. Is that although as infrastructure we put money in, it's of interest to the geo community, so it's funded jointly with them, or it's of interest to the astronomy community, so they're addressing one of their major data or workflow initiatives as you go down that list. So I think the thing to do is to just keep pounding through these, and if you have any questions, this is what I look like. You can now pick me out of a police lineup. We hope you don't have to, but I'm very happy to talk to you in the break time activities. One of the things that is just starting now, food, energy, and water. Important resources, but how do you model it? How do you put together the capability to address? There's either very little water, the western states are having a terrible time of it, or it requires to produce food and energy, it requires water. So how do you secure your food supplies? How do you protect them? How do you grow them? How do you do the trade-offs? And that's going to take an awful lot of large-scale analyses. The agricultural community regularly uses satellite data, tremendous amounts of remote sensing data. And so how do you organize those complex systems? How do you model what's coming down the pike? How do you develop an infrastructure that allows you to have sustainable water resources, sustainable food resources? That's, again, in the early stages. It's basically the entire foundation has pieces of that they're addressing. You'll be seeing solicitations that will be coming out asking for new projects in each of those areas. This is also a tough one. Sort of research traineeship is that how do you, I mean, the picture there is the standard model, but in this day and age with MOOCs and with all kinds of data delivery systems, how do you train the workforce, and especially if it's a workforce that is not just going to be at the university community. In fact, one of the largest and most growing, and one of the things that is important to the country and why the foundation has been getting resources and funding is because it will make a difference to the country as a whole, that it's expected to produce new products and new ideas and things that will make the country a strong one. So currently data-enabled science is a big issue, is that in the science area, do you also speak cyber infrastructure? In the cyber infrastructure area, can you address some of the key science problems? And it's tough because it's two different organizations. It's often, you need to be multilingual to be able to address some of these issues. Another one that is out there is risk and resilience, and some of the acronyms are some of the solicitations that are coming out and will be coming out multiple times, but it's just how do you, in either, the pictures there are dramatic because it's in response to an emergency, but several winters later, the roads that you drive on, the bridges that you cross over are beginning to, how do you decide and prioritize what infrastructure you look at, you change, you upgrade? Nowadays, with all of this remote monitoring that's available, all of this remote sensing that you can use, how do you develop a measurement system? How do you decide? What is your next priority in the various areas, whether it's transportation or utilities, safety issues that are associated with these? Again, more and more of these problems are addressed with a lot of very different, very complicated questions. Don't have to tell you folks is that privacy concerns are a big issue. And so this actually has been one of the fastest growing areas at the foundation, simply because obviously there's the security, the safety issues of data, the personally identifiable information issues, but just from a scientific standpoint, has your data set been corrupted in some way? That having the database lose one bit can make a big difference to the results you get. So how do you have trustworthy reproducible data sets? This was a fun one to work on. Understanding the brain is that everything from the molecular and DNA level all the way up to social behavior, multi-group social behavior. There's a lot of different questions, just how does the brain work? And I guess one of the key ones is, so what are the important variables, the important data to be measuring? So there's going to be a lot of new instrumentation development, a lot of new and existing data set comparisons. So there's again, a number of research requests that will be coming out. There's new center development capabilities coming up among these different areas. I guess this afternoon, one of the things the president will be talking about is the whole idea of smart and connected communities. I'm really pleased one of the awards that we recently made in major research instrumentation was in our area. It's the array of things. It's something that basically the city of Chicago is wired up to try and address, be a test site for a wide variety of environmental, social, urban, engineering kinds of issues. So that'll be, I think it's the announcement is going to be this afternoon. So stay tuned. But basically, it's the whole idea of how do you get regular information to keep a city healthy, safe, and improve as you go along, a good place to be. There's a number of NSF-specific initiatives, and I would be the first one to say we're only a very small part of the community, that we are part of a lot of multi-agency, multinational initiatives in big data. You know, we have colleagues in computing and just at NIH for the brain initiative, materials genome, that there's a lot of interagency kinds of things that are going on. So there's a lot of pressure across these different topics. So let's change topic a little bit. Why are these the initiatives that are going on? So what's the driver? And really what's going on is that there's so much that's going on in technology, instrumentation, computing, the way and the amounts of data that people receive. It's truly changing the way people do science. You don't just go out and collect data on one river. You can have Dove satellite overflights every few hours, and you can have large quantities of everybody has a smartphone now, that you have tremendous quantities of information at your fingertips that you can use. How do you sift among those data sets and choose the things that will help you answer the questions that you need answering? There's been rapid development of instrumentation at all scales, and how do you connect them? How do you compute, visualize, store, discover? It's just how do you find what you need, and how do you answer the questions that are key challenges for your community? One of the things that we're finding is that bullet that's about greater openness is that for a long time the astronomy community, and there's a few communities that open data, help yourself. But when it's health data, when it's personal data, there's some social responsibility that goes with that. But one of the things we're finding is more and more organizations are open. It's not my data set, that there's more willingness to share. And it's partially because there's such a tremendous amount of value to it. So that we're finding that also we have a large number of, with flat government budgets, how do you get the work done? And what we're finding is a lot of the various agencies are sharing resources more. You'll see in a second the two big initiatives that are going on. Nobody has the funding to create the giant computer that is the fastest computer in the world for 10 minutes, and then on to the next fastest computer kind of a thing. Is that what are the resources you need to answer the questions, and how do you share, how do you make a market? If you have extra resources for, in computing at your institution, how do you make it so that you can share those with others at other departments, institutions? How do you get the data moving back and forth quickly? So let me take a second and I'm going to breeze through these next couple because they're sort of news and events that are going on in the Washington, D.C. area. But sort of cyber infrastructure, really and truly what we see at NSF as advanced cyber infrastructure, computing, networking, software, data, those are flip sides of the same thing. And one of the key things is the people that understand it and can help make it work. So they use this word ecosystem, and I think it's true, and I think that we'll have a couple of talks first one that talks tomorrow, is that more and more each of us is a piece of an ecosystem that some of them are growing rapidly, some of them aren't, but in any case, we all make contributions and across those areas. In the area of computing, what we're finding is that this is just some of the advanced computing data, but very rapidly, the usage is, the number of institutions has doubled. The number of PIs per project is tripled. Nobody's telling you anything new. That when you look at a paper these days, it's got a huge list. And the number of active users has quintupled. So rapidly growing usage. Michael was saying, this is for computing data, it's the same way. The hubs are growing rapidly. What we're finding, and they're all too small, but basically that first graph with the colored lines, the bottom line there is, in the old days, the astronomy and the fluid dynamics people had a huge amount of computing that they did, and everybody else, there was very little. It's now just a handful of years later. Even the ones like social and behavioral sciences are now doing more computing than those large computational fluid dynamics people did just 5 years ago. So everybody's much more modeling data intensive now. It's growing rapidly is the point from the second graph. And basically every science is using more cyber infrastructure. That's the lines from there. So it's also increasing diversity of demand. Is that we used to have a lot of small number of very large users for their computational fluid dynamics, their large models. What we're now starting to find is that you get what they're calling the long tail, that you have a medium-sized data set. That's the first graph, is that there's an awful lot of, not necessarily gigantic data sets, but combining those not necessarily gigantic data sets comes up with some really excellent science as well. And the number of institutions that are doing that is growing rapidly. In response, there's been sort of a change in the kinds of computing capabilities that NSF has been providing. So what you're seeing there, it's sort of a time lapse across there, is that there used to be a small number of what they called flagship computers that basically were churning out fluid dynamics, large data set, large activities. The Blue Waters and Stampede in Texas were some of those kinds of capabilities. More recently, they've had a tendency to focus on those more diverse, medium-sized data sets, computing needs. As you grow the community, not everybody's going to need a gigantic computing capability, but they're going to need computing capabilities. So what you're starting to see is, whether you call it long tail, or especially the other thing is data-intensive capabilities that we don't necessarily need to churn out numbers for a lot, but we need to handle a lot of data. Those are different systems. So that's changing. And most recently, one of the capabilities that's just being put in, it's like cloud. Can we have industry help us work with this capability? Rather than growing your own all the time, whether it's computers or data, can you start to work with some very fine, very robust services? So that's kind of how the computing world is changing. There's just recently been a report that's come out. Now we're looking at exascale computing, and there's some results that are coming out of that. That again, what does that computing look like? But do you really need, when the community is broadening out, do you need the kinds of large machines that you're measuring just how quickly they turn through the numbers, or are you needing time to science as your metric? So that's something that's in process and being discussed. There was, again, some movement on that. There's 5 things they're looking to have happen. The middle 3 are the kinds of things that NSF has been focusing on, that just sort of basically, what do you do next? And so I guess the next couple charts show you that in the past, they were kind of 2 communities, modeling and simulation and data science. And over time, it's like, is it a singing dancer or a dancing singer? So over time, we see those again, fusing and answering questions. And then also just as Moore's law sort of is no longer the operative kind of underlying growth activity, what else will we have in the way of capabilities? And so there's some research into those areas. More of the same, that basically strategic computing can help us in that area, in sort of like running the numbers. But the other thing that is obviously a big area is data. And so access to data, there's been some work that's been going on, open access to publications. And so some of the things that you were, again, doing here is that can you have a system that readily and easily gets your information ready to go so that you can publish? That's sort of the first part. You'll be seeing, as you start to win grants in the next few years, that they will be more adamant that your publications are available. I think you're ahead of this curve in a lot of ways because you're also tying the data and the metadata, the collaborative data to it, because I think that's kind of where that's going. It's like, this is an interesting paper, may I see the data? Is going to be a question. And there'll be all of the access, reproducibility, and privacy, security questions that go with that. Lots of data-related activities. The ones closest to me tend to be the instruments. Basically, along the bottom line, what you're seeing is more and more, it's a very diverse group. As closest to me is the Large Hadron Collider, that it's just massive quantities of data that you churn through and compute. That's what those flagship computers are basically used for. But there's also a zillion little biology data sets that combined can be very, very valuable for understanding how climate change is affecting things, or how is evolution changing in speed in some areas. So anyway, if you have questions, we can sit and talk acronyms just until you want to fall asleep. One of the things that we have recently had as an award in the program that we're in, the Pacific Rim, basically they got the entire UC system to sign up and agree that they would be supportive of this activity, which, let's face it, sometimes universities don't necessarily want to work together. But what they've done is that by including everybody's computing and data set capabilities, and including some of the other Pacific Rim, including the telescopes in Hawaii, are there ways to quickly get the data through this system using the computers, using dispersed, diverse resources to answer some major questions. That's just been awarded recently. But again, it's getting back to that ecosystem issue of some have superb computing, some have certain science areas, some have huge data sets. How can you combine those to answer your questions? So basically, we are starting to make progress in this area, but I think there's obviously a lot of open areas and a lot of issues. And it's interesting. I thought, let me make a list of the key problems that we see as key challenges. And it's interesting, you have topic. Congratulations to the Michaels and to their team, because I think that there will be talks and discussions that will be addressing each of those as we go on through the next couple of days. Is that the NSF science community, the kinds of things, just to even find the data that is needed, find the most current version of the data, find version whatever it was so that it's compatible with your data set and you can do a comparative study. You're great progress on that, and I guess Carol is talking about that up next. But I think again, just finding it. The second one is interoperability. Is that you have all these data sets. How can they work together? And I think we're having a whole series of our colleagues from the Air Force Research Laboratory, the ICE system. There's several talks about that. So some good examples there. And then sustainability. Just before lunch today, you're going to hear from a chief information officer. One of the things that so how does something last beyond the grant? And one of the things we've done in a couple of recent calls for proposals is, if you're developing a new data set, data system, or a new computing capability, working with your institution or this group of institutions, how do you intend to include that in your system in the future? And so getting this sort of the chief technology or information officers at an institution involved, such that once this grant is over, it doesn't just get cannibalized. It gets incorporated into a new baseline for the community. Reproducibility, I guess we're going to be having some discussions later today on workflow. It documents it as it goes, and then trustworthy data, the digital identifiers, persistent digital identifiers, or just how do you make sure that the data hasn't been corrupted since you took it? And then just seriously, the last one, growing and training the community. And that's just, one of the questions there is just what is the community? Is it students? Is it future professors? Or is it the health of the economy and the country as a whole? Because having bright, talented, capable people out there finding questions to answer is a very important part of the activity. So unless, unless you have questions, how do you want to work this, Mike?